Welcome to the ABT Time podcast with our groovy new theme music, brought to us by my musician, Christopher Chemo Kemp. And it is tea time, afternoon tea here in California, morning tea in Australia. We have got a special episode here today, and I've got my ABT Time mug. This is our 90-minute special on the subject of fire above and below, where we're going to be focusing on, did I stop sharing there? Are we there, Matt?
We didn't need it anymore.
Oh, okay, good enough. Okay. So we're going to be bringing you this special focusing on the issue of fire, both in the Northern Hemisphere in the case of California, and the Southern Hemisphere in the case of Australia. And let me begin by introducing our expert for California, Christy Brigham from the National Park Service. And Christy, where are you coming to us from?
I'm coming to you from lovely Three Rivers, California, where I am in charge of resource management and science for Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks.
Wonderful. And we came up with this idea starting with Christy, and then we thought, wouldn't it be great to try and include somebody from Australia because they've had equally large problems with fire there. So we called on our official Australian correspondent, Jen Martin. And Jen, good morning. How's everything in Melbourne?
Good morning, Randy. Well, it's a lovely sunny Thursday morning here in Melbourne. So things are looking pretty fine so far.
Perfect. And as soon as we contacted her, I asked her if by any long shot chance she might have a friend of a friend or know somebody in Australia who might be an expert on the issue of fire around the region that she lives in. And who did you bring us, Jen?
Well, I had to think long and hard about your question, Randy. You know, I had to come up with someone really good for you, and I had to think through my extensive networks. It was really tough. And then it occurred to me that not the summer just gone, but the summer before that, someone I know very well spent the vast majority of his summer on the phone to the media talking about our bushfire situation. And that person just happened to be someone that I live with, my husband, Professor Euan Ritchie, who knows a hell of a lot about bushfires in Australia. So I've brought him along. We're actually in the same house. We're just in different rooms, so we don't talk over each other.
Wonderful. And Euan, good morning. Tell us a bit more about you're with Deakin University.
I am, yeah, Deakin University in Melbourne. So good morning, everybody. It's a pretty chilly morning here, so I wish I was in California because I suspect it'd be a little bit warmer than it is here. But yeah, I work at Deakin University. I'm a wildlife ecologist and conservation biologist, and I've been interested in fire for a long time because fire shapes Australia profoundly.
Wonderful. And so we've got a big presentation here for you. And as everybody's been listening to this podcast, this is our fourth episode so far. As everybody knows, this podcast comes to you on two different levels. There is the content, which today our content is going to be about the issue of fire, wildfire in California, bushfires, they call it in Australia. And then secondly, in terms of form, this is kind of an offshoot of our ABT framework course. So we'll be talking at times about science communication, some of the elements that we've used in shaping this presentation. And in fact, last week, we put together an hour session of ourselves on Zoom to work on how we were going to do this whole session. And I'm at the point where I think sometime soon I might create a kind of seal of approval that would be the ABT structure seal. You know, we've got all these things like sustainably harvest and fair trade and all these other seals of approval for products nowadays. I think it'd be nice if you could look at a flyer and it would have a little stamp on there that says ABT-structured, that tells you that the people that put it together put some time in thinking about how the narrative structure would go, what they're going to present, instead of just rambling, which happens in all too many presentations. So towards that end, there are at least three narrative tools that we're going to bring to bear in this presentation here. I want to just mention them briefly, and these come straight out of our narrative training. First of which is the Dobjansky Template, which is something I developed about 8 years ago. It's very simple. A one-sentence tool to help you find the core theme of subject matter that you're presenting. So last week in our discussion, we pulled it out and put it to use. And the template is nothing in blank makes sense except in the light of blank. So we had a short discussion of that. And basically nothing in the case of wildfire in California and bushfire in Australia, and especially over the long term, the history, nothing, any of that makes sense except in the light of what? What's the one message at the core of what we have to deliver here? And we took 3 or 4 shots at it. And then we kind of hit a bullseye. I think Jen first landed on this, and the more we worked on it, it got more accurate, which is misguided confidence. So you're going to be hearing stories about the past in both of these places, and instances over and over again of what we've labeled misguided confidence. You can ask yourself as you're listening to the material if you agree that that really is the story of what's going on. But that's a lot of what we have to present here, at least from the past. Instances of misguided confidence, in the hope that in the present and the future, we'll stop having so many instances of that. Second thing is this ABT structure, which is what this podcast is all about. The and, but, therefore narrative core template. We've used that a lot, putting the material together. Hopefully you'll get a feel for that as the time goes on. Maybe you won't even think about it. It'll just kind of blow by because it's well structured. And then thirdly, there's a catchphrase I use a lot in the training, in the course, which is the power of storytelling rests in the specifics. And this is one of the fundamental dynamics of narrative, which is that everything is at its most powerful when it gets to the most specific. And you see this on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. You can see it in magazines like The New Yorker when they do a big feature article trying to convey some big issue like immigration or identity theft or something like that. They will start the article with the story of one individual, the specifics, to give you a connection on the human level, and often to develop an emotional connection as well. Because when you start scaling it up to the stories of thousands of people, it's hard to really get an emotional feel. So towards that end, we have recruited a volunteer for this session to help us with exactly that, to share an anecdote at the beginning before we get going. A person who can tell his story of how he lost his home. It burned up in one of the fires in California 2.5 years ago. And this is a story that has got, pretty significant emotional component to it. I think it'll give you some attachment to why this is such an important issue. And the guy has a tendency to get so wound up in telling the story that he can go on and on literally for hours. So as a result, I've asked Jen if he gets around to 10 minutes to just go ahead and interrupt him and cut him off. And, we got to move on with this presentation. So on that note, I will invite the three of you to mute your screens, and I will bring on our volunteer who's already here, because our volunteer is myself. And I am going to share with you the story of my house burning down 2.5 years ago. So this is a story that begins in 2006, back when I was living in Los Angeles for about 12 years as a filmmaker. And I had begun surfing a great deal. Like every weekend I was driving out to Malibu to surf. And I got going so hard on surfing that I finally said to my friends, you know what, it might make more sense for me to live out there and come back in for work. So I said I was going to do an experiment for a year. I'll move out and find a place to live out there, and we'll see how that goes. If it's too lonely and isolating, I'll come back. Well, I went out and found myself the most amazing little beach cottage on a cliff at Point Dume, a part of Malibu, one of the most exclusive parts of Malibu. It was a complete freak situation. It was a family owned the property there. This is a cottage that was built in the 1950s, kind of beat up and run down 2-bedroom house. And the rent was ridiculous, a little over $2,000, the same thing I was paying in Los Angeles. So I moved in, and it was on this cliff. I had my own stairs down to the beach below. Next door was big, beautiful house that a person offered to buy it for $20 million. That's how amazing the lot that I was living on was. On the other side of that house was Anthony Hopkins, the actor, living in the house that used to be owned by Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell. So it's really an exclusive site there in this freakish place that I had there. And for 12 years, all my friends would come out and just be in shock when they come in. We had so many fun parties, dinner parties there, sitting on the balcony, watching the sunset every evening over the Pacific Ocean. It was a dream setting until the nightmare hit on the night of November 10th, 2018. I was in Vancouver, Canada. I was attending the Entomological Society of America, where we were meeting, where we were doing the Story Circles narrative training. And in the couple days beforehand, the fires were starting to pick up here, and friends were sending me emails and texting me saying, are you aware? Are you worried? And I said back to them that my house will be the last thing to burn in Malibu because it's on the cliff. You have to burn every other house. By then, the fire trucks would show up and defend it and make sure that didn't happen. So I didn't worry at all until that night when the messages got more and more dire, and I started following online, in particular on nextdoor.com. And every few minutes, people were posting updates. And finally, at 2 a.m., somebody was down on Zuma Beach and posted a note and said, I'm looking up at Birdview Avenue where my house was, and all the homes are on fire up there. And my heart just dropped at that moment. And about 2 hours later, somebody posted the addresses, and sure enough, there was my address. And then by sunrise, I was looking at news websites, And one of them had helicopter footage hovering right above where my house was. And there you could freeze frame it and zoom in, and there was nothing left. It was burned just level. The heat must have been so intense. A couple of weeks later, I finally got to see the site. The washer dryer had melted into just a puddle of metal. They figured it was over 2,000 degrees in some of those fires. So I came back completely disoriented. My car, fortunately, was at LAX. And I went and stayed with friends and started to try and put the pieces together. And I'd lost everything, with the one exception was I still had one work computer in my office at Raleigh Studios, which, by the way, I was in the process of moving out of. And a few days before I left on that trip, I took everything in the office other than that computer, moved it into the back bedroom of my house. Might as well have just taken it straight to the dumpster because it all burned up. And so I was in shock for a few days, and then I began talking with friends and hearing the stories. And my shock turned from disorientation to anger as I heard what had happened. And the city of Malibu did a stunningly incompetent job in relation to this fire. Somebody eventually in the New Yorker or in 60 Minutes has got to tell the story of what transpired there. A year earlier, the Thomas Fire had hit Ojai just to the north, and it was the biggest fire in the history of the state of California. Wouldn't you think if that happened next door that you'd spend the next year preparing for the risk of fire? But they did nothing in the city of Malibu, no preparation whatsoever. And as a result, on that Friday morning when the fire hit, they did a reverse 911 and sent out to every cell phone in the city an emergency message saying, right now, you've got 15 minutes, get all your belongings, get in your car and get out of here. And 13,000 people, almost everybody in the city, poured out onto the Pacific Coast Highway, the only highway that bisects the city, the only kind of pathway in and out of the city, and instantly got caught in gridlock. And some of my friends spent 7 to 8 hours sitting out there in dead standstill. And for the first 3 or 4 hours, they kept the two opposing lanes open as fire trucks came by every 20 to 30 minutes. But there weren't many fire trucks because a strategic decision had already been made. Mistake of sending 40% of the fire trucks in the region north to fight the Paradise fire. And why would you do that at the height of fire season? So they're already way down in resources. And the result was there were very few fire trucks that night in Malibu as the winds were blowing 65 knots, whipping this thing through. 600 homes burned down. And 3 or 4 days after the fire, the city leaders held a city hall meeting, and they got up there on the stage, and for a half an hour, they thanked by name the police and firefighters that were involved in it as the homeowners. And this is where it starts to get really emotional for me. I don't tell this story anymore, but I wanted to share it here to lay the groundwork. The homeowners, these 600 houses that had burned down, were in the audience, and they began shouting and screaming at the people on the stage. What are you doing? Why are you thanking these people? And I talked to a policeman later who said, we didn't want to be thanked. We did our job. The city should have been focused on the people they were supposed to have protected. They did nothing. And someone created a website called Malibu Loves. And that was like a GoFundMe thing where you could read the stories of these families. And you know, what I lost was trivial. I don't have children and I'm not married. I'm just a bachelor, and it was just a bunch of, material crap in my house. So it really was not a giant thing with me. But the principle of what I witnessed there, and these families that lost everything, and they had kids and, just disoriented, made homeless overnight. And it was a GoFundMe thing where you could donate money. And I sat down one night and tried to read through. There were maybe 150 or so stories on there. I read about 20 and just started crying. I couldn't take it anymore. The devastation to the community and the ineptitude of the leaders that didn't know what in the world they were doing. They botched everything. And it got to the point where I couldn't go to social. I decided to stop going to social events, because you go to a party and you meet somebody whose house also burned down, and another person. Next thing you know, the three, you'd sit down and you just start getting into it, sharing all these things. And it felt good to talk to somebody who'd been through the same thing, but somebody else would come over and try and join the conversation. And all three of you would just glare at them like, get out of here. You don't understand. If you haven't been through this, you don't know what we're talking about here. And people would, with the best of intentions, say, well, you really should work through your anger. No, I'm sorry. Just don't even try. And some of the smarter people in the city came to understand that, it's traumatic. And the final thing I'll say about it, and then I will shut up, is that 6 months later, I was asked to speak at an event in downtown Los Angeles, a big thing for 300 or 400 people all through the state involved with the issue of fire. And I was the third speaker that morning. I spoke right after the fire chief, and he got up there And in the middle of his talk, I'm sure with the best of intentions, he said, we're very proud of the fact that only 3 people died in that fire. He finished his talk and he left. I got up and I threw away the first 2 minutes of my script. And there were most of the fire chiefs were still sitting there in the front rows. And I just said, I'm sorry, but that is so completely wrong. 3 people didn't die in that fire. In the weeks and the months afterwards, many, many people died of the consequences of smoke inhalation, and the elderly people. There was an article of one older guy who died of a broken heart, literally for 2 months. His house burned up. He lost everything in his entire life. He had some smoke inhalation problem, but mostly he just sat there for 2 months in disorientation, and then just his heart gave out and he died of a broken heart from the trauma of what he'd been through. And many of those families, it's 2.5 years later, still haven't recovered. The community hasn't recovered. They've tried to do better job for the next time around. It was so maddening. The last thing I did was I published an article in a letter to the editor in the Malibu Times, in which I just vented my spleen on everything that I saw, and just, for shame, the people the job that they did, and they should have been protecting the city better. So I share all that just to kick this off so you can understand. Take the little bit of emotion I've conveyed there, multiply it by the 600 homes here, and multiply it by the thousands of homes that burned down in the past decade and the fires here in west coast of the US, and then the trauma that you're going to hear about from Australia and Black Saturday and things of that sort. And this is a very devastating issue that has really gotten worse in recent years. So that's what we're here to talk about. And using the ABT structure, we're basically going to tell you a story here in 3 parts, past, present, and future. And we'll oscillate back and forth between our 2 speakers. I'll ask each of them to speak for about 6 or 8 minutes. And as we go along, you're welcome to ask questions. You can type them into the chat window or the question answer function. And so on that note, Christy, if you want to join us and give us some insight into the history of fire, I guess for the whole West, but mostly for California and the region that you're in there. And on that note, I will let you take it over.
Great. Thanks, Randy. I'm really excited to talk fire with this group of people. I'm going to cheat momentarily. And before I get into my ABT structure for the first section, I just need to do 2 housekeeping things. First, fire is really complex, and we will try and simplify for you. But with that heartbreaking introduction, I just want to clarify that California has a number of different ecosystems and with different relationships to fire. So I will be speaking specifically about fire in the Sierra Nevada, which is very different than fire in the shrub coastal systems like Randy just talked about. Some similarities in terms of the potential for devastation, but some differences. And then the second thing, I would like to acknowledge that I work on the sacred homelands of many tribes that stewarded this landscape for millennia, including the Mono Lake Northern Paiute, the Paiute Shoshone, the Washoe, the Sierra Miwok, the Yokuts, the Mono, North Fork Mono, the Monachi, and the Tabatalabal. So deepest respect for that stewardship. And that's a great transition to my first section, which is that the forests of the Sierra Nevada were stewarded with fire, were shaped by fire, by indigenous people and natural lightning fires for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. And that fire generated and shaped a beautiful open park-like forest that Europeans loved and admired when they arrived on the scene in numbers in the early 1800s. But being newcomers, those Europeans misinterpreted what they saw. And therefore, they embarked on a 100-year campaign of fire suppression in order to protect that forest in their first foray into misguided confidence. So to tell you a little bit more about that, I just want to describe to you a little bit what that forest looked like and how it had been shaped in this little vignette of the past before I hand it off to Euan. So when Europeans arrived in the 1800s, people like John Muir, Hale Tharp, Alice Eastwood, they saw this amazing forest that seemed to stretch from the foothills to the horizon that went up near the Alpine. And it was full of very large old trees very open and park-like. You could see a long distance in the forest with scattered granite outcroppings and wide open meadows. And they were very attracted to this forest and thought, okay, this is going to be great for timber harvest. It's going to be great for grazing animals. We feel at home here. We have a spiritual connection to this place. We want to make parks. Sequoia National Park is the second oldest national park in the whole service, 1890. So this idea that these were fabulous forests that we want to preserve and protect. So what did they do? We'll talk more about that in the middle section. But what they didn't understand is that what they were seeing was actually shaped by fire. And this, the Sierra Nevada forests in general are what we consider a low severity, high frequency fire regime. So what does that mean? It means that fires burn through the forest frequently, every 10 to 30 years, depending on the specific forest type. There's a lot of diversity of different trees, different understory plants, and that diversity is kept in part through fire, and through that fire that comes in and burns, because it burns so frequently, mainly on the ground and does not burn and kill the whole forest. You get small openings, small clearings where you get a little patch of high severity fire that opens the canopy. But in general, we're looking at a very diverse forest, very open structure that was generated by this frequent low severity fire. And some estimates indicate that 75% of the entire Sierra Nevada mixed conifer burned every 20 years, and that the annual number of acres burning per year ranged from 4 million to 12 million. So that's a lot of fire that was happening on this landscape that was being stewarded by indigenous people, and also by a high frequency of lightning fires, and maybe burning all through the summer and into the fall, moving slowly through the forest, and generating these characteristics that we love so much, these wide open forests, very visible. As you can see, a small snapshot behind me of giant sequoia forest, able to see long distances and walk through this beautiful open environment. So that's where we were in the Sierra Nevada when Europeans came on the scene, recognized the beauty and the value in those forests, but embarked on an unfortunate path based in their misunderstanding of fire suppression to protect this resource that they loved. And that is the end of my opening section.
Wonderful. Okay, that's perfect. Thanks very much, Christy. And Euan, you want to, Jen, do you want to take the segue to Euan? Make up something right now. Go ahead.
You know, I love making things up, Randy. Euan, we've heard this wonderful introduction to the past situation in California. Let's handball it to you to set the scene for what's been going on here in Australia over many, many, many years.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Christy, and also Randy, for a wonderful introduction. Very heartfelt, but really important. First of all, I also want to acknowledge that I'm living and working on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people where I live. And they've had, like many Aboriginal nations, a long association with fire, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. So there's some remarkable similarities in Australia with what Christy was speaking about in the US and in California in particular. And Aboriginal people in Australia, as we know, have inhabited this continent for tens of thousands of years, estimates potentially 65,000 years plus. And importantly, because of that, they have a really deep relationship with fire. It's part of their culture. And this includes, you know, seasonal burning practices and really active management of fire. But regrettably, when Europeans invaded and killed and displaced Aboriginal people, they also began to forge this path of misguided confidence in how we deal with fire, and therefore the strategy of preventing and defending against fire basically came in place. So rather than sort of actively embracing fire and managing it, there was this kind of notion that we should stop fire and we should fight against fire. And this ideal has basically dominated for more than a century. And so I sort of want to just touch on some important context, historical context of what's happened with fire in Australia. particularly previous to European invasion and colonization of this continent. As I said, there's this long association with Aboriginal people and this continent, and they've managed it, actively in many parts of Australia. And they have this, deep culture. So Aboriginal people refer to cultural fires rather than burning or other ways that people often phrase, in relation to fire. It is really important to them. And it's not seen as a threat, but rather this really important tool, a very useful tool that they can work with. And Aboriginal people also commonly refer to country and keeping country healthy. And that includes species. So through managing fire, that can lead to more species being present in an area, because different species have different habitat requirements, different fire regimes. So, some species like areas that have been long unburnt for many, many years. Other species benefit if they're recently burnt, and in between as well. And of course, fire was used to derive food, so fire increased the understory in terms of grassy areas and so forth. And Christy touched on this, which led to grazing animals that they could hunt for food. And so they sustained populations and the people themselves. And because of this, of course, there's this long and deep knowledge. And Aboriginal people, because they were living on country and observing what was going on around them, and I think that's really important, thinking about what Randy was saying about being alert and being observant about what's happening around you and being responsive and proactive to things rather than reactive to what happens. They actively burnt areas frequently, but small patchy fires typically. So not really big, large, intense fires, which we'll talk about later on, but frequent small fires, which really breaks up the landscape. And you can see this. You can see this in imagery and so forth. So historical satellite imagery, you can see from many decades ago, as an example, in Western Australian deserts and parts of northwestern Australia in the Kimberley region, you can actually see what we call fire scars, where you can see the path of fires that have been lit by Aboriginal people, including in Western Australia in the deserts, the Martu people. These little patchworks, almost like a tapestry, if you like, breaking up the landscape with different areas that have different ages of fires. And these are really, really important because in the vast majority of cases, fires are not caused by arson. That does, of course, occur a lot more in recent times, but still, in most cases, fires occur due to lightning. But if you have this, tapestry across the landscape, breaking up the landscape, then you don't tend to get these big, large fires that can be really dangerous and burn lots of area in one hit, which of course is really devastating for wildlife when that occurs. So that's a really important thing to bear in mind, that there was this active management of fire, that breaking up the landscape. But we now know that, looking back in time, that there's been huge change. And Christy touched on this, and I'm not going to get to the future yet, but what we do know is that we can look at paintings. So we can look at early paintings of the landscapes that again sound incredibly similar in many respects to what Christy was describing, and the Aboriginal people themselves talk about this, including fire scientists talk about this themselves, that if you look at many of the landscapes, and particularly the forested systems, you see these big, large trees with quite significant gaps between the trees, and the understory and the grass layer is open. And that's important, of course, because, of course, when you have fire, you need fuel for fire. Of course, you need the understory, and that is usually what catches on fire when lightning strikes. But if there's less of that, there's less chance that a fire will start. But even if a fire does start, it may trickle through the understory, but not get up into the canopy, particularly because there's not as much understory touching or going into the canopy. And so a really, really different landscape, more open, big trees, but lots of space between those trees. But as I said, unfortunately, all of this was upended. So roughly 230 years ago, Europeans invaded Australia and they killed and they forcibly displaced Aboriginal people from many areas. Now, I also just want to say that, of course, in many parts of Australia, Aboriginal people still do live on and manage country, but absolutely from many areas they have been displaced. And that active management by Aboriginal people and their culture, unfortunately, has been removed from those landscapes. So those atrocities have had a devastating impact on the relationship that we have with fire. and it's moved to one that you could sort of more describe as command and control, where fire is kind of seen as this enemy and we should prevent it. We should stop it if it occurs, and we should actively defend against it. Now, of course, no one questions that we shouldn't, manage the risk to people with fire, but the approaches that have been taken, as we've been talking about, are misguided, and partly because of this lack of association with fire, as compared to people that have been living on this land in this country for thousands of years. So this has become the new mantra of misguided fire management and a misguided culture associated with fire management. And I'll now hand back to Randy and Jen.
Great. And let me, and Christy, you can join us now. We'll take a few minutes here for a little discussion and Q&A, kind of addressing what you've laid down here as the foundation of the past in both of these places. I wish I'd given you both buzzers. We could make this like a game show, see who buzzes in first. But here's my question is, tell me the story of the most misguided, overly confident incident that comes to mind in this sad history of not dealing with fire properly. Is there any one thing that's legendary that you can tell us about?
They're both stuck for words because there's probably so many to choose from, would be my guess, Randy.
I was trying to be polite. Christy, I think Christy, you go first.
I don't have one from the past. I wish my colleague Scott Stevens was here, because he told this crazy story that I don't remember the details well enough, about an early attempt to look at prescribed burning, and they so didn't want it to work that they tried to sabotage it and make it go outside the lines. So I think there is some deep-seated cultural resistance to fire, but I don't know the details of that story well enough to recount the full thing, but I think that certainly stands as a shining moment of madness.
Well, in Australia, don't you have some great stories about rabbit control and other wildlife that you've had some misguided efforts there? Have you got anything for fire misguided efforts to match with that?
Look, I think it's more an overall theme, as I was sort of, I guess, touching on in my intro, that, we've had these people, the Aboriginal people of many, many nations, and that's important to recognize too, that scores of nations. So it's not one people, but many different nations across a really diverse continent. But importantly, we've had this incredibly long association. It's the longest living culture in the world, 65,000 years plus minimum. So they know fire. They've been working with fire. They've been managing fire, and they have this healthy relationship, if you like, with fire. And unfortunately, Europeans invade, and they have this notion that we either should stop fire because we fear it, or we should, control it in a way that it's just basically ineffective. And it's been shown time and time again that, when we need it most, some of these more modern methods, if you like, of fire management haven't worked. They haven't kept people safe. So I don't want to talk too much about the future, but I think that's the overall theme.
Sure. Let me ask you on that subject of their, quote, healthy relationship with fire. Did they do anything wrong with fire? Did they end up burning any grasslands, running any species to extinction, changing distributions of species, or were they not abundant enough to have enough impact? Is there anything that was mismanaged?
Look, I mean, Aboriginal people certainly occupied, all of Australia. And in fact, recent research has just come out to say that the population estimates of Aboriginal people are probably deeply conservative, and they're probably in the millions, the many millions of people. So I would assume, like all people, we all make mistakes, but we learn from mistakes and we revise what we do. And if you've had 65,000 years plus to do that, that's a pretty good experiment, right? That gives you plenty of time to change what you do. And I think the problem is in Australia, and probably likewise in California and many other parts of the world, that we've had traditional cultures and people displaced, and people who are very recent arrivals in a relative sense, who don't have that long knowledge and haven't done those experiments, and have now unfortunately made some terrible mistakes. You can see why, because they don't have that culture and that knowledge about what's okay and what to do under certain situations. I think that's really the message. And, that's again why in Australia, it's one of the things that we're trying to get back to, is to try and recognize the importance of this culture, and wherever possible support it as one way of dealing with fire, which we'll talk about more in
let me ask
segments.
Christy, you mentioned some of the early nature writers and John Muir and people of that sort. Are there any writings that they did that acknowledge the interaction between Native American populations and fire? There signs of that?
There may be, but not that I've seen. And you probably have seen some of the consternation around John Muir recently, and being a person of his time and having some unfortunate views of Native Americans and other folks. So there may be writers that recognize that stewardship. I haven't seen those writings. I hope they can turn up. I actually spent a long time trying to find a descriptive quote from an early explorer that wasn't John Muir, and it's deep digging. So he's dominated the field. Since you brought up that Indigenous stewardship, though, I did want to chime in that Euan's description of what happened to Indigenous people there is very similar to what happened here also, where we lost Indigenous management of the land, both through disease, but also through an active campaign of removal and extermination in California in the mid 1800s. And it was a huge loss. And I'm pleased that those tribes are still active in California and are still willing to share their knowledge and stewardship.
Okay, great. On that note, how about if we move on now with the second part and bring us up to the present and a little bit of what's going on in the present, and we'll all mute for the next little round. So go for it, Christy.
Okay, so where we left off in the fabulous Sierra Nevada is that I'm of European descent as well. We arrived on the scene with our misunderstandings of and fear of fire. And we enlisted a great spokesperson to this campaign. Smokey Bear was born as an icon of fire prevention in 1942, and boy, did he do a fantastic job. He got us all on board with preventing forest fire, and it seemed to be going just swimmingly. We really reduced we had few large fires and few fires overall, and it seemed to be working. But over time, the removal of fire resulted in the forest becoming more dense, more and more trees. And those dense and dry forests once again demonstrated our misguided confidence and our misunderstanding. With those forests, therefore, now when we have wildfires, they are large, they are severe, and they are devastating, as Randy described in his harrowing anecdote. And here in the Sierra Nevada, we've been talking about this a lot, and certainly for giant sequoias specifically, we see 2015 as a turning point. We now, in the present, we are having fires that we cannot prevent. 2020 was the worst fire season on record. 5 of the 20 largest fires occurred in California history occurred in 2020. 4.3 million acres burned overall, much of it at high severity, not low severity, surface beneficial fire, but up in the canopy, devastating fire. It's really been a sea change and not a good one. We spend billions every year fighting fires. We are losing lives, firefighter lives, homeowner lives. We're losing homes. We're losing other infrastructure every year. We're losing habitat for threatened and endangered species. We're having large sections of forests and parks closed for multiple years because of remaining tree hazards from fires. Randy mentioned smoke. The smoke from these fires, these large uncontrolled wildfires, are moving into our cities for weeks on end, making unhealthy air quality. The carbon being emitted is off the charts, erosion, loss of carbon sequestration. It's really terrible. And to just give a couple examples to bring home how this really is different, Because I argued in the first section, right, that these forests like fire and they benefit from fire and they have a history of fire. So what is this and why is this a problem? Well, I mentioned in the beginning, low severity, frequent fire. We've now had 100 years of successful fire suppression. We have climate change, which has generated hotter, longer droughts, more severe droughts. And what we're getting are these compounding influences like Euan talked about. So fire suppression means now more trees on the landscape. The estimates now is that we have between 300 and 400 trees per acre, where historically we should have 50 to 80 trees per acre. So a very dense, crowded forest. And on top of that dense, crowded forest, we overlaid the hottest drought in history, 2012 through 2016, and we killed 110 million trees in the Sierra Nevada through a combination of drought and those drought-weakened trees being attacked by beetles. And that is just making the perfect storm for a change in how these fires burn and what they do. So we have these really large fires. The August complex burned over 1 million acres. We have these lightning storms events where we get a lot of fire starts at once and wildfires are breaking out all over the place. And when these fires burn, that density and those dead trees are doing exactly what Euan described in Australia. They're allowing the fire to get into the canopy and burn at such high severity and throw out embers and jump ahead. And it can be devastating to the forest. When you see a severity map for these fires, you'll see these huge patches of red. That is not how fire is supposed to burn in the Sierra Nevada. Tiny patches of red, little canopy openings, those are great. Mainly fire should be on the ground, burning the understory, not up in the canopy, killing the trees. And one really startling example of this that is really heartbreaking for those of us that work with the species, the state trees of California are redwoods. And I work in Sequoia National Park, where we have giant sequoias. And these are some of the most fire adapted plants on earth. They have bark that can be up to 2 feet thick. They have, their first branches are 100 feet off the ground. They need fire to heat the canopy and release the seeds from their cones. They rely on low severity frequent fire to open little canopy gaps and create bare mineral soil and get seedlings to grow. And a lot of these trees, like the ones behind me, are over 2,000 years old. They have survived, and the fire frequency in giant sequoia can be 14 to 24 years. So very frequent fires. So in their lifetime, they've maybe survived 100 previous fires. And since 2015, we've now had 4 wildfires that were able to incinerate 2,000-year-old giant sequoias. And in the Castle Fire that burned in 2020, our current estimate is that it burned up, turned into toothpicks, 7,000 sequoias over 4 feet in diameter. Killed 7,000 trees that had lived hundreds of years, survived over 100 previous fires likely. And the fire that we have now, because of this fuel loading, this dense forest and climate change, drought and beetles, because of this misunderstanding and this decision to suppress wildfire has really changed how these fires burn and the way they interact with the forest, and not in a good way, in a very damaging way that is threatening the values that we were trying to protect, that's threatening our old growth forest, that has generated a forest that's no longer big and open and easy to walk through, that is no longer able to have fire occur healthily in it and recover from fire in these high severity areas. So it's really had some unintended consequences, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we might move away from this misguided confidence into the future. Thanks, Randy.
That was perfect. And yikes, you know, your first segment didn't have much drama, but all of a sudden your second segment now is really taking this. I'm getting back to the anxiety I was feeling telling about my own story. Yikes. Okay, Euan, take it away.
Yeah, it's just it's quite remarkable listening to Christy and just thinking about how many similarities there are to the situation in Australia. And I should point out that, you know, Christy made the point that she's talking mostly about forests, and I'm talking in a general sense. And, you know, fire is, you know, really variable across the Australian landscape. But I just want to sort of revisit what we were talking about. So, as I was saying, you know, when it came to fire, you know, Europeans invaded, they colonized this continent. And in many cases developed this kind of, I guess, approach was excluding fire, which, as Christy was talking about before, it becomes really problematic because fuel loads build up. And they also implemented, you know, these hazard reduction burns, as they like to call them, which is basically trying to reduce fire risk, but they haven't been implemented in a way such as what Aboriginal people do. And also this notion developed of sort of stay and defend or leave. So you had sort of two choices. You can stay when a fire's coming and try and defend against that fire, or you can get the hell out of there and you know and leave really early. But tragically, I want to, you know, say that this really was questioned and scrutinized and essentially came collapsing down on what many people refer to as Black Saturday in 2009. And I'm sure many people would know this event. 173 people died. And it left the nation, this is Australia, and the world in shock. And it was the realization from, I guess, you know, people in charge of fire and managing fire risk that we weren't prepared in the way that we should be. We didn't respond properly to the threat. And the cost of that, of course, was, you know, many, many lives tragically being lost. And there was a strong rethink, therefore, about, you know, this event and what should happen. And therefore, this new mindset has emerged, in part influenced by practices that I know happen in California, where people are actively encouraged to leave. And so I first want to quickly talk about, you know, those paintings I mentioned before. So as I, you know, talked about previously, you know, we talked about this really open, you know, environment, particularly the forests, big gaps between the trees. But that changed. And you can in fact even see that in later paintings, the exact same landscapes looking incredibly different. So ones that went from big trees, big gaps between the trees and an open understory, increasingly became more forested, denser, much higher fuel loads, which of course are one of the key ingredients for fires to start. And if they do start, they spread more rapidly, they're more severe, and they become devastating in their outcomes. And how devastating, you might ask. So I want to just, I guess, give a quick snapshot of just what's happened with fires before we get up until right now. So 1939 in Australia, Black Friday, 71 people dead, 1.5 to 2 million hectares burned. So start getting your head around the scale of some of these fires that we experience in Australia. There's very few places on earth that experience the frequency of fires and the scale of some of these fires I'm going to talk about. 1983, Ash Wednesday, 75 people dead, 2,000 homes burnt, 418,000 hectares burnt. So both of those fires are shocking enough in themselves. But I think the one that's really familiar to me, because it's very much in my, I guess, you know, in recent times for me personally, is what's referred to as Black Saturday in 2009. So a little over 10 years ago. And I remember this vividly. So 1 million acres burned. And in the lead up to Black Saturday, we all knew something was wrong, something was amiss, and partly to do with the weather. So we had a series of incredibly hot days. Peaking on Black Saturday, where in and around Melbourne, we had temperatures of 46.4 degrees Celsius. For those friends across the Pacific, that's roughly 115 Fahrenheit, and in some cases it was 120 Fahrenheit in some areas, so exceedingly hot. The fires that eventually started traveled kilometers each hour, and they surged through the canopy. So like Christy was talking about the forests over there, once the fires get up into the canopy, they are terrifying. And the fire basically rolls through the forest, it jumps, it spots. It's essentially like watching a tidal wave, but it's a fire and it's moving through the forest canopy. It's utterly frightening. It was estimated that the fires, at some point, the temperature reached more than 2,000 degrees. And you can see some of the townships, metal window frames and so forth. The windows basically melted with puddles on the ground. Aluminium hubcaps, basically from cars, were again melted on the ground. And the fire itself generated its own weather. So when fires become really severe, they can essentially generate their own weather, where you have these sort of updrafts of incredible temperatures. And that can actually lead to these clouds forming, which then generate lightning storms, which then cause further fire fronts away from where the fire originally started. And you can have, therefore, fire fronts coming from multiple directions. It's truly apocalyptic when you think about it. And when you hear about, some of the people having to fight these fires and being caught in these fires, it's utterly terrifying. So I can absolutely sympathize with, what Randy was talking about earlier on. And, I can't imagine what firefighters must face when you're, confronted by the Black Saturday fires in particular. So the result of this was that, tragically, as I said, 173 people were killed. So just awful, awful numbers. And as a result of this, in Australia, we had what's called a Royal Commission. And that's a really formal and very rigorous assessment of what went so horribly wrong. And there was many things that went wrong. And in part was messages and the ability to share messages. So messages weren't received at all. So warning people to get out, or that a fire's coming and you've got so much time to move out of your home, or messages received that were wrong. So they were out of date. So saying, as an example, a fire might be coming in 4 hours. Well, actually it's coming in 2 hours, or the fire's here when actually it's somewhere else. Or fires, the messages didn't come at all. And many people, of course, didn't have appropriate technology. So we're using much better technology like phone apps and so forth, where we can have better real-time access. But back then, we were very reliant on things like TV and, and radio and so forth. And some of these things broke down. They just didn't work. And so people were basically left in the dark, not really knowing what they were facing, and therefore not being able to respond properly. But as I said, also importantly, this notion of stay and defend really was deeply challenged during this period, and is now, thankfully, I think most people would agree, being discouraged, actively discouraged, and now people are being actively encouraged to leave early.
Yeah, great. And on that note, I think we'll take another pause here for some commentary. And Jen, have you got any fire jokes you want to share? No? Okay. Sorry. I thought I was trying to lighten this dark and somber mood up a little bit. But take it away, Jen. See what we got for thought.
Look, thank you, Euan, and thank you, Christy. I think what you've both just shared is pretty deeply heartbreaking. So I don't know that I have any jokes coming to mind. And I guess even more so perhaps than I realised earlier, the parallels between our two countries and what we've done in the recent past are pretty striking. And you've both just said really clearly, this is not how fires are supposed to burn. So I guess something I'd love to hear from you both is, can we tease apart, let's just imagine a wonderful world in which climate change were not happening. Can we tease apart what would be going on right now if climate change weren't an issue, but we were simply in inverted commas, dealing with this situation of far more forested habitats, landscapes than we should be dealing with? Can we tease that apart and think about what it might look like for fires now?
I think I'll jump in this time. I think, we obviously need to be managing the fuel loads and the fire risk. And of course, we talked about how, in both cases, people had been doing that for a long time before that was interrupted, and, that knowledge was lost and those practices were lost or removed. But I think the point is, with climate change is that even now, if we could do those things, it's becoming increasingly difficult to stop fires occurring because, as an example in Australia, we're having these long, prolonged droughts, and I know California's having them too. and many parts of the US, in fact. Incredibly high temperatures, which ends up meaning that your forests, or even not even forests, woodlands, open areas end up being tinder dry. And then you have these extreme events like high temperatures on a particular day, strong winds, and it doesn't need much to start. And so, as it's been said in Australia, is even if you have been able to put in these other, practices into place, the fire will start from lightning, and it doesn't matter what you've done beforehand. The fire will just take off because the conditions are so extreme that there's really nothing you can do to stop that. And so that's becoming an increasing challenge, is that even if we can reduce some of the risks, climate change increasingly is beginning to override our ability to manage these fires and in some cases prevent these fires, which is a deeply challenging notion, because the question is, well, yeah, what do you do at that point?
Yeah, so for California, just quickly, it's similar but a little different, and I'll just give two quick examples. One's a little depressing and the other's more hopeful. The slightly depressing example is in the park that I work in, Sequoia National Parks, we've been doing prescribed fire, deliberately introducing fire under the right conditions since the late 60s. And it really actually seemed like it was going quite well in terms of getting back forest structure, a more open forest structure. And in fact, the photo behind me is taken from an area that's been burned twice previously in the past 40 years. And you can see how open it is. And so I think that example, without climate change, we would be in much better shape in terms of if we did to try and turn back the clock and re-establish a beneficial relationship with fire in a more straightforward way. What's happening to us now is that climate change and the drought is overlaying this other additional stress on the forest, such that we're getting outcomes when even prescribed fires happen that we're not anticipating. And so far, those are mild, but they're concerning. So we have 30 giant sequoias that have been killed by beetles, and beetles we've never had a recorded instance of a beetle killing a giant sequoia. And we think that interaction of drought and wildfire and climate change stress. The beneficial example is that there is an area in Baja that's very similar to here, where they never suppressed fire, and they still have, it's a very open pine forest. Scott Stevens done a bunch of research there, and they did much better during the drought, very low tree mortality, and it still tolerates fire. So maybe they are definitely interacting. Maybe we can solve it, maybe we can't.
I've got one question here that would open up a half-hour discussion we can't afford, but let me just toss it out there. And actually, maybe Jen and I next week will get deeper into this question. It sort of originates with our friend Julie Clausen asked the core of this question, but I modified it myself, which is, in my lifetime, growing up as a kid, we had terms like swamp and jungle. And swamp was a horrible place you didn't want to get stuck in. Jungle was a terrifying place. Our society and language revised those, reshaped those. Swamp became wetlands, jungle became rainforests, and more positive feelings around them, which have been kind of, I think, probably central. Language does matter, and they've probably been central for developing a little bit more ecologically conscious approach to nature. Julie's question is there anything along those lines to move away from fire as this terrifying thing? It's a much bigger challenge there than swamp or jungle, but reshaping the image of fire as actually being something that has got a functional role, and it's not just something to be stamped out everywhere. Same thing with sharks. Sharks, everybody grew up in my generation, kill them, get out their jaws. And nowadays trying to explain they're part of the ecosystem. So let's do just a quick little shot of both of you, but yes or no on that. Are there campaigns to try and reshape the broader thinking perception of fire? Christy first, maybe.
Yeah, we talk a lot about beneficial fire and ecosystem benefit fire. It's hard though, because of the complexity of trying to explain to people what is beneficial fire versus destructive wildfire. So trying to give the message at once, we want to avoid high severity fire that's burning up my 2,000-year-old trees, but this other low intensity, low severity fire is good. So we're working on it. I don't think we've cracked the nut but we're working
Okay. All right. Jen, make a note, next week's podcast episode. That's going to be a topic for our discussion. We'll dive in deeper on that. And Euan, anything in Australia along the same lines?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a brilliant question. And in fact, an Aboriginal fire scientist, Michael Sean Fletcher, talks about this, about the language that's used in relation to fire. And he talks about, European people talk about fire brigades, containment lines, preventing. It's all military language. It's all fighting, containing, commanding fire. Aboriginal people don't use that same language. They have a much healthier association with fire, and the language reflects that. So I think that's a really important observation and point. And I just want to, again, also quickly touch on what Christy was saying too, that it's, fire is positive, and it's really hard to have these discussions because Australia, like the US, is such a diverse continent. So we have had successes with fire management, in particularly Northern Australia, where Aboriginal people are doing lots of fire management, and Central Australia in the desert. So it is really hard. I'm talking a lot in this case about forests, and they are quite different in how they operate with fire compared to, say, more open savannas and deserts. So I just want listeners to be aware of that fact, that there is this tricky kind of complexity there. And as Christy was also saying, it's the communication is so critical because we have the same challenges. We want to say fire is healthy and fire is important and we need it to promote biodiversity, but we don't want these fires. These fires are problematic fires. Right. And getting that right to the public, is crucial.
That's fat. All right, we'll have more discussion on that next week. So Christy, how about the final segment here? Take us into the future, and then we'll have you do the same. So take it away.
Yeah, that's actually a great transition. So to start this section of the future off on a more positive note, because I do feel positive. I think there is hope. It is not too late. California still has a lot of fabulous forest left. Millions of acres of forested landscape, beautiful forests that provide habitat for endangered species, that bring in millions of dollars for recreation and tourism, that provide spiritual solace, that are still the homelands of the tribes that I mentioned earlier, that are really important for carbon sequestration, clean air, water storage, all these things we care about. But, I missed one which is that we're also investing more in protecting these forests and treating them and doing treatments. But even with all that, what we're doing right now is not working. It's not going fast enough. We see it, 2020 was the biggest fire year on record. If we cannot solve this problem, we will lose the things we care about. We lost 10% of the large giant sequoias in one fire year. Our annual acreage burn this year was 4 million acres. If we keep on this way, we will lose a lot of forest to high severity fire. We will lose vast ranges for our threatened and endangered species, things like Pacific fisher and California spotted owl. So therefore, we must find a new solution. We must walk away from the trap of misguided confidence, and we must walk away from the trap of fear of fire. We have to learn to live in relationship with fire. And to me, that means three things. Working together to create fire resilient communities. If we are going to live in these environments, we need communities that when the fire comes, we can leave and we come back and our homes are still standing. We need to work together to do this new work, the work that the Indigenous people have done for millennia of creating a fire resilient forest, of using every tool in the toolbox to reduce fuels. And we need to accept and work with beneficial fire, like we were just talking about, whenever and wherever possible. Not all wildfire is bad. If we can concentrate on the fire we need to fight because of where it's burning and the conditions, and let other fires burn, if we can use prescribed fire, if we can work with tribes to do more cultural burning. So there is hope and there are solutions. I do want to say, though, because I do fear the trap of misguided confidence, the world is changing. Our environment's changing constantly. The forests are responding to climate change. The animals are responding to the forests. We need to go into this humble and with a learning mind and a learning heart, and be in relationship to these forests and how conditions are changing. If we continue to read the landscape and think, oh, I have the solution, I know it, we're just going to do this and we're going to do it across the whole landscape and everything will be fine. We just did that for 100 years and it didn't work. So we really need to go at this with a new approach and a new attitude. And to echo some of the things that Euan said in terms of this relationship with fire, I want to end my future section with two quotes from Ron Good, who is a member of the North Fork Mono and is a great practitioner of cultural burning. And he says these two things about fire. Fire should be something from a natural point of view that's healthy. It is a tool to revitalize the land. And he goes further and says, this is not just about renewing the land, but about renewing ourselves. So I think we do not have all the answers, but we know a new direction to go in.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Euan, I got a feeling you're going to echo some of those things, but take it away for your final little segment here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Christy. So yeah, the Black Saturday fires, as I said, in 2009, that they really shocked, this nation, Australia, and this new, I guess, approach, psyche, if you like, did emerge. And I think importantly and positively, progress was made in terms of how we respond to fires. And that was really important because all of a sudden, 2019, 20 comes along and fires start in winter in rainforests. And then it goes from there. It gets worse and worse and worse. And we see the biggest fires that we think are on record for Australia. But importantly, even though those fires, and I'll talk about how big they were in just a second, even though those fires occurred, we had much greater loss of life. Much fewer lives were lost. So 34 people, which of course is still tragic, and it's not a comparison numbers, but we talk about 173 in 2009. We have come a long way for what happened when we consider the scale of these fires, and I'll get to that in just a second. But we did see environmental devastation on a scale like never before, and we are absolutely, as Christy was also saying, in uncharted territory in terms of what our species and ecosystems are facing. So even species and systems that we think about being potentially fire resilient are now being challenged because fires are becoming far too frequent and severe. So those time periods where, species, particularly plants, as an example, might like a 10-year window to have fires occurring to help things like germination, they're becoming too narrow, and they're actually even knocking out what we thought were fire resilient species. So it's really time, for the world to recognize, and I think this is the thing about the Australian fires, we hope that would be a wake-up call for the whole world. It's like, this can happen to Australia, this can happen anywhere, that's a flammable area. That it's a wake-up call that the consequences of climate change really need to be addressed. And if we don't, we're going to have more and more of these really quite catastrophic events, and therefore this kind of continuation, if you like, of this long-term trend of misguided confidence. So just to quickly tell you about the scale of these fires. So as of roughly early March 2020, it was estimated that more than 18 million hectares of area burnt. So just get your head around how big that is. It's utterly huge. So we're talking about bigger than many European countries, much, much bigger. More than 5,900 buildings were destroyed. 99% of the area for potential habitat, had at least one threatened species in those areas. And so the devastation for wildlife was unbelievable. 6 million hectares of threatened species habitat was burnt. And we saw the imagery of obviously scorched or dead koalas, kangaroos hopping through the flames. One of the things that people probably weren't as aware of was also how some of our freshwater systems were impacted. So what happened, of course, is you burn these environments, you lose all the vegetation, it sits like ash on the ground. And also in and around where you have housing and so forth, you have all the debris from these buildings. And then unfortunately, we had heavy rains that all washes down into the creeks. And then you end up having creeks that are full of this sort of muddy ash that chokes all the aquatic life, full of pollutants, and that ends up in our waterways and including also in our oceans, and has a devastating impact on freshwater and marine species. And the unfortunate part, before I get to some positivity and solutions, is that with climate change, just like in California, in Australia, we're going to expect, unfortunately, more and more of these events, and potentially, hard to fathom, but potentially worse events, because we're going to have more of these hot days that create the fuel loads, and then the weather events associated with those, and then lightning, and then the rest, takes care of itself. So the question is, what can we do about that? Well, of course, the number one thing we need to do is to treat the underlying causes of climate change. And there's plenty of discussion about that already. But we need to, of course, learn from and reinstate cultural burning practices. And that needs to be led by Indigenous Aboriginal people themselves. And so there's a really important movement in Australia about self-determination of land management. So not us, taking over cultural practices of Aboriginal people, but Aboriginal people themselves, doing that on, country. And, Christy touched on this with her beautiful quote at the end, and it's exactly the same in Australia, that Aboriginal people talk about fire. It's not just for, burning vegetation. It's part of their culture, and it has so many other benefits, and it's associated with what they, describe as healing as well. It brings people together. So fire can be used in a very positive way. And of course, we will also need to adapt. That's just a fact. So we will need to have better ways of responding to fire, whether that be, more fireproof housing, of course, technology that allows us to get away from fire and also put fire out. So there's a whole suite of things that we need to change.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Euan. And I just want to save 15 minutes here now for some discussion, and we will finish right at 90 minutes. And we got a question here that's come in from Dan McCollum. It's pretty lengthy. Let me give you this it sounds really good, the whole thing that he said here. To what extent can a case be made for letting fires burn and allowing them to, quote, reset forests and put them on the path to getting back to a more, quote, pre-fire suppression condition? Recovery may take a long time given the intensity of many fires, but there would eventually be recovery in some form. There'd be large costs to communities and property owners, but many of those costs continue to be incurred by maintaining the status quo. The alternative is to go in and reduce fuel loads, very expensive, but there are some opportunities to make use of that excess biomass, which would reduce the expense at least a little, potentially lead to other benefits, healthier forests, less wildfire risk, jobs in the community, and others. There are always trade-offs. Christy, why don't you start in on that? Does that register?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be annoying, I'm going to say, but I think it's true that both are correct. And I think we need to do both. So we do need to let some wildfires burn. And when we have a large fire like the Creek Fire, maybe half or more burns at high severity and the rest burns at low severity or moderate severity. That low and moderate severity fire, that's good. That's resetting. That's what we want. But we really do need to identify where we're going to get high severity fire and do the hard work to not have that for two reasons. What we're seeing now, because our forests are mixed conifer, they rely on living trees in the forest to regenerate. We have areas, they will not go back to being forest. They burned at high severity. They're going to be pokey whitethorn. They're going to be shrubs. They will not be forest unless we actively replant conifers or giant sequoias in them. And those trees take hundreds and thousands of years to grow. So I do think there is room for both of those strategies, for letting some natural ignition and even human ignition wildfires burn if we know how it's going and conditions seem not terrible and it's in a place that's okay. But we also need to massively increase our fuel efforts.
Okay, let me ask you a clarifying question. When you say we need to, this and that, who's in charge?
Christy, obviously, Randy. Christy's in charge.
She's the boss.
There are a lot of efforts going on both by the state and the federal government. So we, the Forest Service is working on their property. The Park Service, we're burning, we're thinning, we're doing pile. The state's supporting those efforts, and the state's trying to work on private forests and private lands. So it's complicated. Everywhere there's a different forest landowner, there's different people trying to solve the problem in different ways.
So simple question, simple yes or no answer, because it'd take an hour, I'm sure, to go on the explanation, but is that a source of problems of who's in charge? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, there you go. And Euan, on that note, same question to you.
Look, my answer would be remarkably similar to what Christy was saying. She was talking about her forest species, and in Victoria, which is the state that I live in, particularly in the forests, there's a species called alpine ash, and it's quite similar to how some of your conifers, their life histories. So they need fire to germinate, and they can survive fire when they're big trees. But if those trees, when you germinate, if they have a fire within 10 years, the young trees die. And that's what we're seeing increasingly. So the fire frequency, not just the severity, but the frequency is becoming squished. It's becoming too close in time. And so, this idea of letting fires go in some senses is good, because yes, it will sort of bring it back to a state that might be more similar to the past. But unfortunately, because of also climate change, we're going to see more and more fires. So those systems won't recover. As Christy was saying, they will change, and they may become completely different systems. So, we talk in, the ecology world about step changes, and landscape changes. So you go from having a forest to maybe having an open woodland. And in some parts of Australia, with these recent fires, quite disturbingly, we saw rainforests burning. Now, rainforests are not supposed to burn. Most of the tree species in rainforests have really thin bark, and if a fire goes through them, they die. Whereas, big eucalypts have thick bark. They can resprout from the bark. They can also resprout from the roots. The rainforest species, most of them can't do that. And so we've seen chunks of rainforest dying, and that will be replaced by more open, drier woodland, which is also more flammable. So it is really hard to generalize about where we should let fire basically take its course, and where we need active management. And in terms of who's in charge, I think lots of people need to be in charge. It's a community-based approach.
Okay, not to be too obnoxious here, but on that topic of rainforest burning, and not to date myself too much, but 1983, I was finishing my PhD, and one of the fellows in my department worked on orangutans in Borneo, I believe, and the rainforest went up in Borneo back then. That's 38 years ago. So is this something that's been going on for a long, long time, of rainforest catching fire, or is it really that recent? Or
there's always been fires in and around rainforests, but I think the point is now that it's becoming more common. And I think what was disturbing to us in Australia was that a fire started in a rainforest in winter. So we used to have, like in California, really distinct fire seasons, right? You'd have a fire season, then you'd have a period of the year where you could be pretty confident that there's not much of a fire risk. That safe period, if you like, where you don't have to worry about fire, is becoming increasingly smaller. So the fire season is stretching out. So we're seeing, protracted droughts, drying conditions, which make those rainforests susceptible, right? Because around the rainforest, it becomes drier, and then all of a sudden a fire comes. And then you can imagine, kind of incremental, if you like, those fires start eating away at the rainforest. And so I think that's what we're getting worried about, is that we're seeing this, step change, this significant change in the climate that is making systems like rainforests just far more susceptible to fire than they ever were.
So Euan and Christy, we just said Christy was in charge before, but I want to be in charge for a second. I've got my magic wand here. You each get to change one thing in the system, but only one thing. If you could pick one thing that you would be in control of that you could change, whether it be funding, whether it be the language that governments use, whether it be, there's a million things you could do. What would be your number one pick for what you would change to try and get us to a better place leading into the future? You've both got thinking faces on, so who should I pick on first? Euan, do you want to jump in?
I'll jump in, but I'll be naughty and say that the thing needs two things. So
no, you only get one. Sorry.
So, and it's a related concept. So part of the issue in Australia is there's been this notion of wilderness, as if in wilderness doesn't have people in it. And that's deeply offensive to Aboriginal people, of course, who've been managing landscapes for millennia and have been part of those landscapes. And so if there is one thing that I would like to see is people being in landscapes and actively managing landscapes, but that requires money as well. Mm-hmm. And I'll leave it there.
Okay.
I love it. I'm going to just say ditto. It needs the money and the people everywhere in the forest.
Which I think leads really nicely to a question we've got in the chat from Maureen, which is that fire doesn't care who owns the land and crosses ownership and jurisdictional, I can't even talk, boundaries, you know what I mean? So Maureen's question is, how do we get people to work together on solutions that actually work at the landscape level rather than people worrying about their own jurisdictions or worrying only about their own jurisdictions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's already happening. Because of that exact issue, it's been in our face that the fire can start anywhere, on private land, on the forest, on the park. And so landscape, I think similar things are happening in Australia. Here in California and the US, landscape scale networks are developing that are partnerships between the public, the private, different government agencies, and we're working together to look at how fires move across our landscape and what's susceptible and where we need to work together. We have one here in the Southern Sierra Nevada called the Southern Sierra Leadership Forum that is doing exactly that, looking at Forest Service, National Park Service, state and private lands, what's the vulnerable landscapes, how's fire going to move, how can we work together?
Yeah, I think there's great examples in Australia. As an example, Northwestern Australia, the Kimberley region, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy has been working with government agencies, with Aboriginal people, with farmers who have really large properties for cattle. And they've been instigating more, if you like, traditional burning practices that Aboriginal people would have been doing. And that's been having great success in reducing bigger, more severe fires. So that those conversations and those groups, if you like, coming together already happening. And the other thing that I think is also really important to mention is that increasingly in fire and fire science, we're seeing Aboriginal and Indigenous people coming together with other scientists in what's called right way science. So where you've got, both groups, different cultural perspectives coming together with a common goal, right? That is to learn about fire and to manage fire in a more effective way. So those wonderful conversations are happening already.
I'm just laughing because Randy's hassling me in the chat about how much he's paying me to come on his podcast with him. Randy, if you want me to do your work, you'll have to pay me more, mate.
We'll write a grant proposal. In a couple of years, we'll raise some funds. Go for it.
So look, we've got 5 minutes left and we've actually got some excellent questions in the chat here. So we're going to jump to Jeff's question, and Jeff from the Forest Service. And Jeff says, I believe fire science is known for a long time that control burns are important and should be more widely used. I'm guessing that you guys would both agree with that. But there are barriers. There's risk aversions to control burns going, or to prescribed burns going wrong. There's a culture that favours suppression, which you've both really laid out for us. So given this, how much is better communication on the issue going to help promote this use of prescribed burns? How much is communication the issue?
Yeah, for the US, I'll say I feel like communication is a very tiny part of the issue, and we actually need to change the incentives and have systems change in the management agencies and the regulatory agencies. We have been we saw it in the beginning of this story. we want to preserve the forest, so let's suppress fire. That, you know, it doesn't work. So, and that's how we act now in all these places. No, inaction is favored over action. And we see the results of inaction. Do you want this entire landscape to burn up in high severity fire, or are you going to incentivize and pave the way and make it easier to do mechanical treatments and prescribed burning? Those are your options. And right now, all the incentives, like Jeff is saying, are on the side of inaction and then responding when the emergency comes, rather than taking the risk and incentivizing and making room for those active management tools.
What's Euan?
Yeah, look, I think communication is part of the equation, but I think it's also fair to say that people would disagree that controlled burns always work. And in fact, the problem is that, as has been shown in Australia, is that when we've had these really extreme fires like Black Saturday or the 2019 Black Summer, as it's been referred to, control burns actually didn't save much at all, because the severe weather conditions, and which we know are being compounded by climate change, just override all of that. So now, I'm not saying that active management of fire is not important, and control burns, if you want to call them control burns, they are important. But I think we have to be honest about where they might be important and when. And that's really important, because many people have pointed out that there's a danger sometimes that doing these control burns gives the public this false notion of safety, that this will stop big fires happening. And it just hasn't, and it can't, because particularly in these big forests that we have in Eastern Australia, similar to your forests in California, if you have these events where the fire gets into the canopy, doesn't matter what you've done on the ground, it's game over. It just rolls through the top of the forest, and they jump kilometers, and the rest is, as we know, tragic. So we have to be, I guess, clear about what context we're talking about.
On that happy note, we will bring this all to a close. We're out of time. But one little tidbit I want to say right at the end was, I gave my emotional thing at the beginning about my house burning down. And then you hit me again, Christy, when you talked about 5,000-year-old trees burning down. And what erupted in the back of my mind was 5,000-year-old corals on the Great Barrier Reef in the years that I spent working on the Great Barrier Reef. And the same thing's going on there, which makes me realize, Jen, our next special like this next month is going to be the same damn thing about above and below. We'll get somebody from the Caribbean, and I know exactly who I'm going to get from Australia, and we'll do the same thing for coral reefs. And that's a good connecting element, is the sequoias with the giant, massive Porites coral heads that are 5,000 years old, also dying in these events. On that note, everybody feel free to send us emails. Thank you all for the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but they were great questions, and you guys are awesome. That was great presentations. Yeah, hit the nail on the head, the whole deal. Thank you so much. Hope everybody enjoyed this, and keep tuning in to the ABT Time podcast. Thanks, Jen, Euan, and Christy.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, see ya.